This is Soft Porn Adventure for the Apple II, designed by Chuck Benton, released in 1981. Wikipedia claims this was the first commercial video game to feature sexual themes and content. Aside from the title being Soft Porn Adventure, I'll have to take their word on that. I can't get far enough into the game to see any of that purported content for myself. Let's not delude ourselves here, people. The human race is a horny species, always has been. People were carving chubby short stacks back in 30,000 BC. Short films in 1896 were risque enough that they had to be censored. And of course, the interactive nature of video games provided too tempting a proposition for people to live out their sexual fantasies. Even when the hardware wasn't powerful enough to support these images, people still tried. Oh God, they tried. Now, this isn't a comprehensive look at the entire history of pornographic games, just a couple that I found interesting. I'm also skipping past the Atari age entirely because, while it's sort of the lost AVGN episode, James Rolfe talked about Mystique's catalog enough and he did it well. But there's one game he neglected for years and has only touched upon its box art since. X-Man. You play as, Cyclops, and you need to get to the center of a maze while avoiding hazards like teeth and scissors. He's actually naked, but I think I can get away without censoring it. Well, I call it a maze, but that's a misnomer, because it's really just one path from the start to the center, with offshoots never bigger than a few tiles. Which is great, because that means it's not possible to outmaneuver the enemies. All you can do is hope that they don't go down the paths you're hiding in, because there's definitely no visual indicator as to the route they're going to take. And hope they don't turn around at some point because you move so much slower than everything else. And every step you take is murder on the ears. But if you can make it to the middle, a reward awaits you. I can't show you what that reward is because holy shit is it explicit for an Atari game, but I can tell you that it sounds like hell. While pornographic console games were perhaps at their most prominent on the Atari 2600, they most certainly did not stop once hardware got more advanced. The Famicom and NES sold gangbusters, and Panician made good use of that Nintendo power with a trilogy of tits and some of the rarest games on the system: Bubble Bath Babes, Hot Slots, and Peekaboo Poker. Let's start with the most famous of the three, Bubble Bath Babes. Maybe it's because the title is just catchy, or maybe it's because the boobs are just right down there, no effort. It's good to have something to look at, because the rest of the game is nothing much to look at, or listen to for that matter. It's really boring and droning to play for long periods. Let's just fix that real quick. Aesthetic. Now I can focus on matching colored bubbles with all I've got. The name of the game is creating lines of 4 or more of a single color to get them to disappear. It should be easy if it weren't for all the extra bullshit like the garbage blocks. Garbage blocks are common in puzzle games, but usually as a way to promote competition in 2-player puzzle games like Puyo Puyo or Puzzle Fighter. Here, they only exist to make life more difficult, since they appear to fill any empty space between a bubble and the top of the board. Blocks only fall when the shape they came in on is broken, and even then, not always. I'm not sure what the deciding factor is. The only way to get rid of the garbage block is to completely clear the bubbles on top of them. You would not believe how easy it is for a massive assault of garbage to pile up, becoming practically unclearable. And the reason it's so hard to clear bubbles is the range of motion on the blocks. While the colors within the block can be shifted around, the shape itself is set. Can't even be rotated. So if the colors are good, but the shape doesn't work with what's already on the board, tough shit. Now you have to fit it in awkwardly because you can't make it fit, there's an empty space, and there's more garbage. And the game doesn't work with squares as its basic shape, but rhombuses made of circles, so it's just not intuitive. And some of the pieces are Tetris 2 weird. It's fucking impossible. So that bit of nip down at the bottom is all I'm seeing. I think you can get a more detailed image by popping the 5 bubbles with letters in them, but I can't say for certain. Whether it's game mode A or B, I'm just not able to do it. And why would collecting 5 letters even lead to nudity in the first place? Is it like popping the bubbles on her bath to expose the girl? Where do the letters fit into that? And if she's covered by the bubbles, why are her boobs out down there already? I demand strong adherence to logic in my pornographic games. Getting forcibly stripped by a cooking competition, now that's fine. This game sucks! Oh, but I guess I'm wrong. American Video Entertainment, creators of this perfection, saw the game as worthy enough to release with all the nudity removed as Mermaids of Atlantis, with the topless woman replaced with a mermaid. Which, depending on who you talk to, is probably even hotter. They do make a few improvements over the original game, like a third terrible song, speed options, and a difficulty select that amazes me wasn't in Bubble Bath Babes, because that joke writes itself. Too bad the game is still awful, now without the one thing to set it apart. Perhaps the better gamble is on Panician's next game, Hot Slots. You know what? I'll let you decide. Here's the gameplay. I'm hiding nothing. This is the game. However much this game cost mail order from Panician was spent on looking at the front of a static slot machine, mindlessly dropping in coins and spinning the dials, all backed by this grating, maddening 6-second music loop. There are 2 other backdrops with other songs, but trust me, it's all the same trash. It's the sheer concept of this game that baffles the fuck out of me. Despite the total lack of skill involved, people play slots for the chance to win money, as slim as that chance realistically is. I am not a gambling man for exactly that reason. Obviously, that's not the case in a video game, so the prize is a naked woman, I assume. The problem is that there's the upfront cost of paying for the game in the first place. And NES games weren't cheap. Paying that much money for a game of chance at the prospect that you might get to see something naughty if the fates align is ludicrous to me. And it's not like the game you already paid for is rigged in your favor. I've put as much time as I can into this game before I'd go brain dead, between testing and recording, i.e. about half an hour, and while I managed to keep breaking even with meaningless tokens, I've never gotten the sexy. I'm not saying the real treat should be given so easily, apparently that gets you banned in New Zealand, but when there's no skill behind the game, there's nothing. Even without the existence of sprite rips to look at the girls free of charge, this game has literally no value, no reason to exist. By that token, it might very well be the worst game ever made. Imagine if, back in the 80s, you bought a porno magazine, but every time you turned to the page, you only had a slight chance to see something good. And the magazine cost over 10 times the cost of a magazine. And if the picture wasn't all that good anyway. But bad news, I have a gambling addiction now and I can't leave the casino. So let's hit one last table with Peekaboo Poker. On a basic level, it's a very similar concept to Hot Slots. Win a casino game, get some nudies. With just one difference. It's poker instead of slots. A game that, while still a casino game that has a strong element of luck, is also the kind of game that one can get good at. I know how to play poker. I can make calculated risks as to which hands I'm likely to get when I swap cards. Even when I make a drastic mistake and lose a lot of money, I can swing back, get $1,000, and finally see some 8-bit breasts. I have to admit, this is a visual aesthetic I kind of like. And that's good, because there's nothing else to look at during the real card game. There's a choice between 3 vixens to be your opponent, but for the majority of the game, all you'll see is their faces make a few expressions. I don't know if you're even supposed to be able to read them in the heat of the moment. Other than that, it's just having your face down on the table. The music isn't as bad as Hot Slots, but it's still bad. And the sound of either winning or losing large sums of money will probably make me deaf by 30. Plus, this may seem like a small thing, but I really do appreciate that there's a logical reason for the nudity here. You know, because strip poker is a thing. Something like Hot Slots, where there's no correlation, makes it feel like the developers just wanted to cheat people out of their money by putting unrelated nudity in the most unfair game to wring as much game time out of the players. Looking at it realistically, is there just some girl sitting next to your machine taking her clothes off if you get a certain slot combo? Does that count as gold digging? Thus concludes Panetian's Big 3 on the NES. None of them are particularly good games, and Hot Slots is hot shit, especially for the prices they command for collectors today. But they certainly make for interesting history. Hopefully this look was enough to satisfy your curiosity, so you don't have to actually play them. Bubble Bath Babes is the closest to being a normal game, but it's no Tetris. All 3 sacrificed gameplay for sex appeal, neglecting that there's no interactive titillation in the games themselves, making them no more exciting than traditional porn. Just a hell of a lot more tedious and expensive. Perhaps we just need to jump up a level in technology to get what we truly crave. Well, something like the true 16-bit power of the Genesis or Super Nintendo might be too much. Maybe just a half step with our good friend the TurboGrafx 16. Here, Games Express provided the PC Engine faithful with their dues, with a whole new collection of sexy software. Like Lady Sword here, head deep into the dungeon for something. A fan translation does exist, but I felt no desire to patch it myself because I just don't care for these sorts of dungeon crawlers, especially the first-person kind where it's so easy to get lost. And totally not because I didn't know about the translation until after recording. So, without being able to read the language at all I see here is being interrupted every few steps by who I assume is my party, and getting destroyed after only a few encounters, all generic monsters. If I didn't find this game while searching for this very topic, I would assume nothing was amiss. Alright, let's stop fucking around here and bust out the big melons. The early 90s gaming scene was dominated by fighting games, thanks to Capcom's innovation in the genre, which brings us to Strip Fighter 2. But first off, how did I find this game even existed? Well, old Mr. Captain L ventured to the TurboGrafx page on the Spriters resource in search of some Rondo of Blood sprites, and look, Strip Fighter 2 is one of the most viewed games on the platform. Right next to Godzilla Battle Legends. I don't mean to spoil anything, but if Battle Legends had Mothra, it would beat Strip Fighter 2 in raw sex appeal. It's nice of Strip Fighter to have a name that tells you what it's going for, saves me the trouble of describing it. Except, it's more World Warrior and less Super Turbo. In hindsight, isn't it disappointing that the original version of Street Fighter 2 only had 8 fighters to choose from? Well, Strip Fighter has it beat. In the wrong way. There's 6. Clearly, I'm drowning in choices, so I made the tough choice of picking Yuki, because she's the only one I find attractive, and that's, you know, an important criteria for a game like this. Is it just me, or does she look like Kasumi from Dead or Alive? First impressions aren't all that bad, honestly. The character animations are a marked step down from a professional effort, but the sprites aren't awful. The backgrounds look nice as well, even if most of them are inspired by a certain other game. And the sound doesn't make me want to vomit to my own death, which is a step up from everything else we've looked at here tonight. It's a fight through the 6 members of the roster to the end, and awaiting at the end is the title screen. I joked about Street Fighter 2's selection before the boss characters were playable, but this one doesn't even have boss characters. And as for endings, well, I don't know, I'll come back to that. So, at least it's a short one. Or is it? Because there's something hard here, and it's not what I wanted. I'll give Street Fighter some props. While a lot of the moves have unorthodox commands, the motions are never more than a quarter circle. And a very special thanks to Anani Mami on GameFAQs for writing a moveset guide. This ground wave move from Yuki, for example, is just a quarter circle back and heavy kick. So why am I having so much trouble with it? Full transparency, I'm using a keyboard instead of a controller, but it shouldn't be this difficult. I can't understand the reason, but inputs for special moves get dropped all the time, to the point where relying on them is unwise. Oh, but the computer doesn't have that problem. No, they spam their moves absolutely relentlessly, never letting you get a word in edgewise. And just to make the whole affair even more infuriating, the dizzy rate in this game is cranked up, so even when you can get up in between the attacks, more often than not, you're dizzy and just have to take the next blow. And keep in mind, the difficulty here is at the default 4-star level. Winning even a single round against these odds is a miracle. Just to confirm that something is actually wrong with this game, I also played the TurboGrafx port of Street Fighter 2 for comparison. And while far from being arcade perfect, it's a competent port. In the console wars of Street Fighter 2 ports, this was satisfactory, I'm sure. Much like on the Genesis, the mere existence of this game necessitated the development of a 6-button controller. And while a handful of TurboGrafx games use 4 buttons on the controller, the only 2 that use all 6 are Street Fighter 2 and Strip Fighter 2. But it seems like only Street Fighter used it correctly because only Street Fighter controls well. I'm still inconsistent with Shoryuken motions, but I can pull off Hadokens and Tatsumaki Senpu Kyaks with reasonable accuracy. Even at the same 4-star difficulty, I handled it pretty well. By my own standards at least, not like this unfair bullshit. And why do I have the difficulty at that level in Strip Fighter? Because that's one of the draws of the game. Win a round at a moderate difficulty and be rewarded with an image. Is it relevant? Not really. I think this one is supposed to be Martha, but it's hard to tell. Bottom line is, she's still got some clothes on, and it's a completely different art style. For the wild challenge of even seeing this, it's not at all worth it. So let's turn this baby down to 2 stars and go back through. Yep, I played through the arcade mode at a lower difficulty, one too low to see the erotic pictures, which is why I can't confirm whether there are endings or not. At only 2 stars, even with the controls only working half the time, the computer's aggression is toned down enough that I can still win. And that's good, because there's more to the strip parts of the fight than just a reward for putting up with terrible game design like every other game we've seen. See, certain moves involve the characters becoming nude. Yuki's uppercut has all her moves disappear, and Amanda has a boob tackle. And then the move ends and the clothes come back, and all that's left is the lingering memory. There's no reason the clothes should come off in the first place. This one might be more the fault of my expectations, but when I heard the name Strip Fighter, I imagined a game where clothes would get permanently ripped off due to damage, and that sounds way better. The way it is now, it feels like someone decided to make a sprite edit ROM hack to make the characters completely naked, but they gave up after a couple of sprites and just released that. I won't deny that this is the most ambitious of the 6 games we've looked at here today, with the most game to it, but it still falls victim to the exact same traps. The game is not fun, with some major faults in how it plays. And to mask that and artificially extend game time, the difficulty is way too high. Back in the 90s, people didn't have the luxury of internet to look up porn whenever they were more desperate, and Phoenician and Games Express would take advantage of that to hold sexual content hostage and make people play their shitty games.
Must have been dark times, those 90s.
Problem is, even back then, there were magazines. There were movies on VHS. There were movies on cable television. Games weren't the only option. Now, are you ready for the twist of the day? The 3 NES games we've looked at, while published by Phoenicians, were all originally developed by a company known as Hacker International, a Japanese developer who released a number of unlicensed pornographic games. And they weren't just limited to the NES, they released games for another platform, the PC Engine, under the pseudonym Games Express. The world is nothing more but a tapestry of connecting threads. Hacker International has been out of business since 2000, but for their last 5 years they reincorporated as Map Japan and began releasing normal licensed games for the then new Sony PlayStation. I've never heard of any of the games they released in that time, but they clearly must have been prolific. A few were available on PSN. So why did they stop with porn? Why did the unlicensed game market as a whole stop with it? Well, for starters, unlicensed games just sorta dried up when new consoles made releasing unlicensed games nearly impossible. In addition, as time progressed, I feel the need for these sorts of games diminished. As Sega and especially Sony challenged Nintendo's dominance over the video game market, both offering a less prude alternative and forcing Nintendo to chill with the censorship, official games were allowed to be sexier with the benefit of being real, full, well-made games. They're often less explicit than something like Bubble Bath Babes. Most modern games don't show nipples to be arousing, but a more subtle approach doesn't seem to bother anyone. Even though it was just the character design, I'm willing to wager that more people jerked off to the original Tomb Raider than they did every game in this video combined. And there's certainly no shortage of games that do strive primarily for an appeal below the belt, even with certain parties opposed. Plus, there was one major paradigm shift: the rise in computers among the average person. Suddenly, everyone had a machine that was easier to develop on, could run applications without needing to bypass lockout systems or print on proprietary cartridges, and a robust network for distribution and sales is right there. Those without the full gambit of skills needed for game development can use pre-existing engines to make their visions real. Plenty of people use RPG Maker for just that reason, which I wouldn't know anything about. Even those who didn't have the ability to make full, competent games could get in on the action through modification of existing games. Blueballed by Senran Kagura's light bar sensors? Buy the game on Steam and download nude mods. Now players get a professionally made game and full frontal along with it. This much wider market for both developers and players has broadened horizons so much. Now that so many more people can make pornographic games, law of averages dictates that at least some of them will be good at it. Now, the right people can come together to make something like Monster Girl Quest a reality, which, yes, the gameplay is rudimentary and lackluster, but it's non-intrusive in a visual novel, and it doesn't detract from storytelling so good that, no exaggeration, it rivals the best in video game storytelling. Metal Gear Solid 2, Ghost Trick, Monster Girl Quest, all the same caliber. Some of those developers even keep the spirits of old alive with modern sensibilities and polish. Peekaboo Poker? It still exists, but much more visually engaging and with characters we love in Strip Poker Night at the Inventory. And sometimes that influence is a lot more direct, as is the case with the continued Strip Fighter series developed by Studio S. They've released a number of games, with several Strip Fighter games and updated revisions, with the most recent being Strip Fighter 3, but I sampled Strip Fighter 5 Abnormal Edition. They've also made a Monster Girl fighting game that's available on Steam.
I might have to remember that one.
Street Fighter V has a noticeably larger roster, but I picked Yuki again because it's hard to give up a main. And she's gotten quite the upgrade since we last saw her. Almost 30 years worth of innovations in fighting games have trickled down into the mechanics with things like super moves and 3v3 that I didn't capture, and the genius decision to have responsive controls and balanced AI. On the default difficulty, I fought my way through several opponents, including waifu Dan Hibiki, without much trouble. This gave me enough time to come to the conclusion that it's still not very good. The characters have some detail in their designs, but their movements are so stiff. The game itself is functional, but it lacks any unique characteristics aside from the strip part. And while this game does indeed allow the player to strip their opponents by finishing them off with a special move, what follows is pretty tasteless, trust me. I should have figured a game where half the female combatants have boobs bigger than their heads wouldn't know the first thing about tact. We live in the year 2020. You can buy much more polished and mechanically rich fighting games with better rosters, graphics and content, more tasteful character designs, and even sexier women than anyone in Street Fighter.
The problem is, by appealing to the base human desire for sex, developers feel like they can get away with anything because, hey, there's tits, people will buy it, and they're probably not wrong. You know me, I'm no prude, but if I'm paying for a game, I need more than that. I need a good game, and that's not too much to ask for, is it? And while you're at it, give me a good story with defined characters so that I remember it. I've already talked about how Monster Girl Quest has incredible characters that make me relate to the game, remember it, recommend it, come back to it years later and still enjoy it. Even something like Senran Kagura, early on, they had good stories. But it seems like at the end of the day, the lowest common denominator always wins out. You're creators, people. Take pride in that. Create. Make something worthwhile. It's not that hard, I promise. You can do it.